You know, life has this strange way of sneaking up on you. One moment, everything feels predictable, like you're walking down a straight road, and then, out of nowhere, it takes a turn you never saw coming. That's what happened to me. It's been a year since I heard those words, words that hit me like a freight train, words that forced me to face something I had been running from for months. And even now, I still can't shake them. They echo in my mind, late at night when the world is quiet, when there's no one left to distract me. I keep asking myself, how did it get to this point? How did I let it all unravel so completely? And the hardest question of all, could I have stopped it? It wasn't supposed to happen. People say that, don't they? When they're looking back on something they regret. But I mean it. If you told me 2 years ago that I'd end up here, sitting in this house, alone with my thoughts, haunted by everything that's happened, I would have left. I had a family, a life. Maybe not perfect, but whose life is, right? I had a husband, a home, and stepchildren I cared about deeply. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was mine. And then, it all started to slip. It wasn't one big thing, you know? It never is. It's the little things that creep in, the moments you brush off, thinking they don't mean anything. A look that lingers too long. A conversation that feels just a little too intimate. A hand that grazes yours and sends a shiver up your spine when it shouldn't. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just lonely, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew better. You see, loneliness has a way of playing tricks on you. It whispers in your ear, telling you things you don't want to hear. Like how invisible you feel. How you can stand in a room full of people who are supposed to love you, and still feel like you're screaming into the void. That's how it was for me. My husband, bless him, he wasn't a bad man. Just distant. Always working, always tired, always somewhere else, even when he was sitting right next to me. And I told myself it was fine, that this was just marriage, that I could live with it. But then he moved in. My stepson. He'd been away for a while, finishing college, trying to find his footing in the world. When he came back, it was like a storm rolled in, but not the loud, chaotic kind. No, it was the quiet kind. The kind that sneaks in slowly, until one day you wake up and realize you're drenched, and you don't even know when it started raining. At first, it was innocent. It really was. We talked. That's all. Just talked. About life, about dreams, about things I hadn't thought about in years. He had this way of looking at me, like he actually saw me, not just the version of me I'd become over the years. And let me tell you, when you've spent years feeling like a ghost in your own home, that kind of attention, it's intoxicating. But here's the thing, when something feels good, when it fills a void you didn't even know was there, it's easy to ignore the warning signs. It's easy to convince yourself that it's harmless, that you're just overthinking it. But looking back now, I can see it all so clearly. The long talks that went on just a little too late. The inside jokes that made my heart race in a way they shouldn't have. The moments when his hand would brush mine, and I'd feel a spark I hadn't felt in years. And yet, I told myself it was nothing. I had to. Because admitting it was something, that would have meant facing the truth. And I wasn't ready for that. But the truth has a funny way of catching up with you, doesn't it? No matter how far you run, no matter how many excuses you make, it always finds you. And when it does, it doesn't knock. It kicks the door down. That's what happened the night he said those words to me. The words that shattered everything. The words that forced me to see what I'd been trying so desperately to ignore. I can still hear his voice. Soft, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should say it but couldn't stop himself. And when the words finally came out, it was like the ground beneath me disappeared. I felt like I was falling, like I was caught in a storm with no way out. And all I could think was, how did it come to this? How did we let it get this far? But before I tell you what he said, I need to take you back. Back to where it all began. Because to understand how we got here, you have to understand the little steps that led us down this path. The moments I ignored. The choices I made. The warning signs I refused to see. So, let me start at the beginning. Let me show you how it all unfolded, one mistake at a time. But before we jump in, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. This inspires and motivates us to bring you more stories like this, because you mean a lot to us and we truly appreciate you for doing so. My husband and I had been married for 15 years. A decade and a half of shared routines, shared responsibilities, and shared silences. It's strange how you can live with someone, share a bed with them, and yet feel like you're on opposite sides of the world. He was a good man, or at least, he tried to be. But good doesn't always mean present. He worked long hours, always chasing the next deal, the next project, the next goal. He provided for us, no doubt about that, but somewhere along the way, he stopped providing himself. And me? I became the woman who waited. Waited for him to come home, waited for him to notice me, waited for something, anything that never came. I didn't even realize how much I was disappearing until my stepson moved in. He was 28, fresh out of college, and trying to figure out his next steps. His mother, my husband's first wife, had passed away when he was young. I think part of him had always been searching for that connection he lost. At first, he was just another person in the house. Quiet, polite, and easy to be around. He spent most of his time in his room or out with friends, and honestly, I barely noticed him. He was just there. But then something shifted. It started small, like these things always do. A comment at dinner, something simple like, "You always make the best lasagna." It caught me off guard because, honestly, when was the last time anyone noticed anything I did? Not my husband, that's for sure. The words felt warm, like a ray of sunshine on a cold day, and I held on to them longer than I should have. The house, as picture-perfect as it might have looked from the outside, held its own kind of quiet tension. It was the kind of place where you could hear a pin drop in the evenings. My husband was always holed up in his office, glued to his laptop, the glow of the screen lighting up his face, but never the room. I'd grown used to the silence, filling it with the hum of the dishwasher or the soft drone of a TV show I wasn't even watching. But when my stepson came home, that silence started to crack. He wasn't loud or overbearing, but he brought this energy with him, a kind of warmth that felt so foreign in our house. He'd sit at the kitchen table while I cooked, asking me questions about my day, about my hobbies, about things I hadn't even thought about in years. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. Why would a 28-year-old man care about the life of a 55-year-old woman? But he did. Or at least, he made it seem like he did. And for someone who'd been starved of attention for so long, it was intoxicating. I remember one evening, not long after he'd moved in. My husband had gone out of town for work, a week-long trip, as usual, and it was just the two of us in the house. It was raining that night, the kind of steady, soothing rain that makes you want to curl up with a blanket and forget the world. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when he came in with 2 cups of tea. "You've been on your feet all day," he said, setting one down on the counter. "Come sit with me for a while." There was something so simple, so genuine about the way he said it. No agenda, no ulterior motive, just an invitation to be seen. And God, did I want to be seen. We sat in the living room, the rain tapping softly against the windows, and talked for hours. He told me about his life, his struggles, the dreams he had and the ones he'd given up on. And somewhere in the middle of it all, he asked me a question I wasn't ready for. "Are you happy?" I froze. The word hung in the air like a loaded gun, and for the first time in years, I didn't have an answer. Was I happy? I didn't know. I didn't even know what happiness looked like anymore. But the way he looked at me, with those soft, understanding eyes, made me feel like it was okay not to know. From that night on, things changed. Slowly, subtly, but undeniably. He started spending more time around me, helping with little chores, offering to run errands, finding excuses to be close. And I let him. I told myself it was harmless, that he was just being kind, that I was overthinking things. But deep down, I felt it. The shift. The way his compliments lingered just a little too long, the way his touch seemed to burn when his hand brushed mine, the way my heart raced when he walked into a room. I tried to fight it. I really did. I reminded myself that he was my stepson, that this was wrong, that I was imagining things. But the loneliness I'd been drowning in for years whispered back, telling me it wasn't so bad, that it was okay to want to feel alive again. And then there was my husband. Oblivious, as always. He didn't notice the way I smiled more when his son was around. He didn't notice the way his son looked at me when he thought no one was watching. He didn't notice anything. And maybe that's what made it so easy. If he didn't care enough to see me, why should I care enough to stop? But deep down, I knew this was the beginning of something I couldn't control. The small cracks in the foundation of our family were widening, and I was standing right in the middle, pretending I couldn't feel the ground crumbling beneath my feet. And yet, despite everything, I didn't walk away. I didn't pull back. Because for the first time in years, I felt alive. And that feeling, it's addictive. It happened on a quiet weekend at the lake house, a place that should have felt peaceful, serene, like an escape from the weight of everyday life. My husband had insisted on the trip, though it felt more like an obligation than a retreat. He spent most of the time fishing or glued to his phone, handling urgent work matters, as he always called them. Meanwhile, I floated through the days like a ghost, half present, half wondering why we even bothered coming as a family when it felt anything but. The house itself was charming, nestled among tall pines with a view of the lake that stretched out like glass. But even the beauty of the setting couldn't mask the emptiness I felt. My husband left early that morning, a fishing rod slung over his shoulder and barely a glance in my direction. "Don't wait up," he'd said, with the same disinterest that had come to define so much of our relationship. So, there I was alone, as usual. Or at least, I thought I was until I heard the soft creak of footsteps on the porch. It was my stepson. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, his face lit with that easy smile he always seemed to wear. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing me a mug and settling into the chair beside me. At first, we just sat there in silence, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional call of a bird, the gentle lap of water against the dock. It was the kind of quiet that felt both comforting and unnerving, like the calm before a storm. I don't know who spoke first, but somehow we found ourselves talking about everything and nothing all at once, dreams, regrets, the little things that make up a life. He told me about his struggles, about how he felt like he'd been drifting since graduation, like he was stuck between who he was and who he wanted to be. His words hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for, because they mirrored my own unspoken thoughts. I told him about the things I'd given up over the years, my art, my love of travel, my sense of self. Sometimes, I said, my voice quieter than I intended, I feel like I'm living someone else's life. He looked at me then, really looked at me, his eyes searching mine as if he understood every unspoken word I didn't know how to say. "You shouldn't have to feel that way," he said softly. And just like that, the air between us shifted. There was something in his gaze, a warmth, a spark that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't overt, it wasn't inappropriate, but it was there. And for the first time in years, I felt seen. Not as a wife or a stepmother or a woman defined by the role she played, but as me. The me I'd lost somewhere along the way. I should have ignored it. I should have brushed it off as a moment of kindness, nothing more. But instead, I found myself leaning into it, into him, into the way his presence seemed to fill the empty spaces I'd grown so used to. We sat on that porch for hours, the sun dipping lower in the sky, the conversation flowing as easily as the breeze. And yet, beneath it all, there was an unspoken tension, a line we hadn't crossed but could both see so clearly. When my husband finally returned that evening, smelling of lake water and old bait, the spell was broken. But the feeling lingered. I couldn't stop replaying the afternoon in my mind, the way he'd looked at me, the way his words had wrapped around my heart like a balm I didn't know I needed. And for the first time, I started to wonder if this was the beginning of something I couldn't control. The days that followed were a blur of half-smiles and stolen glances, of casual touches that felt anything but casual. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it, that I was lonely and vulnerable and reading too much into things. But deep down, I knew better. I knew there was a spark, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. It's funny, isn't it? How one moment, one seemingly innocent conversation can change everything. Sitting on that porch, sipping coffee with my stepson, I didn't realize I was standing at the edge of a cliff. But looking back now, I can see it so clearly, the way the ground started to crumble beneath my feet, the way I leaned into the fall without even realizing it. And so, the seed was planted. A small, fragile thing, barely noticeable but impossible to ignore. And as much as I tried to bury it, to pretend it wasn't there, it began to grow. Slowly, silently, like a vine creeping through the cracks of a forgotten wall. And before I knew it, it had taken root, wrapping itself around my heart, pulling me into a place I wasn't sure I could escape. I told myself it was nothing. Just a moment. A fleeting feeling. Something that would pass as quickly as it had come. But the problem with feelings like that is they don't just go away. They linger. They sit in the back of your mind, quietly growing, quietly waiting for the right moment to surface again. Every glance he gave me, every laugh we shared, every little moment that should have been ordinary seemed to carry a weight I couldn't explain. I started noticing things I hadn't before, the way his smile would linger just a fraction longer when he looked at me, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the way his presence seemed to light up the room in a way I hadn't felt in years. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself he was just kind, just thoughtful, just filling a void my husband had left behind. But the truth was, his attention felt good. Too good. It filled a space in me I hadn't even realized was empty. And that scared me. Because as much as I wanted to believe it was harmless, I knew it wasn't. Not for me. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. It settled in my chest like a heavy stone, weighing me down, making it hard to breathe. I was his stepmother, for God's sake. What kind of person feels this way about their own stepson? What kind of woman lets her loneliness blind her to what's right and wrong? I hated myself for the way my heart raced when he walked into the room. I hated the way I found myself looking forward to our conversations, our shared moments, our stolen glances. But most of all, I hated that I couldn't stop. And yet, I didn't want to stop. That was the worst part. Because for the first time in years, I felt alive. I felt seen. I felt like someone actually cared about me, not out of obligation, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And that feeling was intoxicating. The worst moments were the quiet ones, late at night when the house was still and I was alone with my thoughts. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction, every word, every look. I'd tell myself it was wrong, that I needed to distance myself, that I needed to put an end to whatever this was before it went too far. But then morning would come, and he'd be there, smiling at me like I was the most important person in the world, and all my resolve would crumble. My husband's absence only made it worse. He was always somewhere else, at work, on his phone, in his own head. Even when he was home, he wasn't really there. He didn't see me. He didn't hear me. He didn't care. At least, that's how it felt. And the more distant he became, the more I found myself leaning into the connection I had with his son. I tried to create distance. I really did. I started avoiding him, finding excuses to leave the room whenever he was around. I buried myself in chores, errands, anything to keep myself busy. But it didn't work. He noticed. Of course, he noticed. And one evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, he sat down beside me and asked, "Did I do something wrong?" The question caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say. How could I possibly explain that the problem wasn't him, it was me? That I was the one who couldn't control my feelings, who couldn't draw the line, who couldn't stop falling deeper into something I had no business feeling. "No," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't do anything wrong." He didn't press me, but the look in his eyes told me he knew there was more to it. And that made it even harder to stay away. The guilt and shame were relentless, but so was the longing. They battled inside me, tearing me apart, leaving me raw and exposed. Some days, the guilt won, and I'd spend hours berating myself, convincing myself I was a terrible person, unworthy of forgiveness. Other days, the longing took over, and I found myself daydreaming about him, about what it would feel like to let go, to give in, to stop fighting the inevitable. It felt like I was living two lives. In one, I was the dutiful wife, going through the motions, pretending everything was fine. In the other, I was a woman on the edge, caught in a storm of emotions I couldn't control, drawn to a man I shouldn't want. And the lines between those two lives were starting to blur. I tried talking to a friend once, without giving away too much. I mentioned feeling lonely, feeling invisible, feeling like my marriage was crumbling beneath me. She told me it was normal, that every marriage goes through rough patches, that I just needed to be patient, to work through it, to communicate. But how could I communicate with a man who didn't even see me? How could I fix something that felt so irreparably broken? I started avoiding mirrors because I couldn't stand the woman staring back at me. She was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, someone I didn't want to be. But no matter how much I hated her, I couldn't change the way she felt. I couldn't change the way I felt. And so, I stayed caught in the middle, torn between what I knew was right and what I couldn't stop wanting. Torn between the woman I was supposed to be and the woman I was becoming. Torn between the life I had and the life I couldn't stop imagining. And every day, the struggle grew harder. Every day, the lines blurred a little more. And every day, I sank a little deeper into something I couldn't escape. It started innocently enough. At least, that's what I told myself at first. A touch on the hand here, a lingering hug there, small gestures that should have meant nothing. But they didn't feel like nothing. They felt like the start of something I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself. One evening, we were sitting at the dinner table, just the two of us. My husband was working late again, as he so often did, and the house felt quieter than usual. I don't remember what we were talking about, something trivial, something ordinary. But at one point, as I reached for my glass of water, my hand brushed against his. It was such a small thing, over in a second, but the electricity that shot through me was undeniable. I pulled my hand back quickly, almost spilling my water in the process, and laughed it off as clumsiness. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes, a softness, an understanding that told me he felt it too. And then there were the hugs. At first, they were the kind you'd expect, a quick squeeze of the shoulders, a polite gesture of support or gratitude. But over time, they began to linger. His arms would hold me just a little longer than necessary, his hands resting lightly on my back as if he didn't want to let go. And the worst part? I didn't want him to. It wasn't just physical, though. It was the way he confided in me, the way he opened up about things he'd never shared with anyone else. One night, as we sat on the porch under a sky full of stars, he told me about the guilt he felt over his mother's death. I was so young, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But sometimes I feel like I should have done something, anything, to save her. I reached out, placing a hand on his knee, and told him the words I'd wish someone had told me during my darkest times. You were just a child. There was nothing you could have done. None of this was your fault. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude, and I felt something shift between us. It was no longer just a bond of shared experiences or mutual understanding. It was something deeper, something I couldn't ignore. And then, without even realizing it, I started confiding in him too. I told him things I'd never told anyone, not my friends, not even my husband. I told him about my fears, my insecurities, the way I felt like I was fading into the background of my own life. He listened, really listened, in a way no one else ever had. And the more I opened up, the more I felt myself leaning on him, relying on him in ways I knew I shouldn't. We became each other's solace. He was the person I turned to when I needed a break from the emptiness of my marriage, and I was the person he turned to when the weight of his past became too much to bear. It was comforting. It was intoxicating. And it was dangerous. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, he came in and sat down beside me. You shouldn't have to do all this by yourself, he said, reaching for a pile of clothes. I laughed and told him it was fine, that I was used to it, but he insisted. For the next half hour, we folded shirts and socks and towels, laughing about the ridiculousness of some of my husband's mismatched outfits and joking about how terrible he was at laundry. And then, As I reached for another shirt, our hands touched again. This time, neither of us pulled away. The silence that followed was deafening. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. And then, just as quickly as it happened, the moment was over. I stood up, mumbling something about needing to check on dinner, and fled to the kitchen, my mind racing. I knew I was in too deep, but I couldn't stop. Every interaction, every shared moment, every touch felt like a lifeline pulling me out of the emptiness I'd been drowning in for years. But with every step we took closer to the edge, the line between what was right and what was wrong became harder to see. And then, one night, the lines blurred completely. It was late, and the house was quiet. My husband had gone to bed hours ago, and I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a photo album I hadn't touched in years. He came in and sat down beside me, asking what I was looking at. I showed him the pictures, photos of family vacations, birthday parties, moments that felt like a lifetime ago. We laughed at the outdated hairstyles and fashion choices, but as the laughter faded, a different kind of silence settled between us. "I wish I'd known you back then," he said, his voice soft. "I think we would have been good friends." His words caught me off guard, but before I could respond, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if he should. But the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world, made it impossible to pull away. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he whispered. And in that moment, I realized I felt the same way. But I also knew we were walking a dangerous path, one that could shatter everything if we weren't careful. And yet, as much as I wanted to stop, I couldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't want to. It was one of those nights that seemed almost designed to break you. The kind where the storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside. The rain pounded against the windows, relentless, accompanied by the occasional boom of thunder that seemed to rattle the entire house. My husband was away on a business trip, as he often was, and the emptiness of the house felt heavier than usual. I'd tried to distract myself, busying my hands with cleaning, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, but nothing could shake the restlessness in my chest. By the time evening rolled around, I found myself in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket and a movie playing softly on the TV. I wasn't really watching it, just letting it fill the silence when he walked in. My stepson. He carried a bowl of popcorn, his hair slightly damp from the shower, and he smiled at me in that easy, disarming way he always did. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, already sitting down beside me before I could respond. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and scooted over to make room for him. The couch was big enough for space between us, but somehow we ended up sitting close, too close. The warmth of his body beside mine was palpable, and I could feel the tension simmering in the air, unspoken but undeniable. The movie played on, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts were a whirlwind of guilt, longing, and the constant battle between what I knew was right and what I couldn't seem to resist. He laughed at something on the screen, a deep, genuine laugh that made my chest ache. I glanced at him, and for a moment, he caught my eye. It was such a small thing, a fleeting look, but it was enough to send my heart racing. "You're quiet tonight," he said softly, turning to face me fully. "Everything okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." He didn't press me, but his gaze lingered, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Compassion? Understanding? Something deeper? I didn't know, and I was too afraid to find out. But the longer we sat there, the harder it became to ignore the pull between us. And then, in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. His touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "You're incredible, you know that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think you realize how amazing you are." I froze. His words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous, and I felt the weight of them settle in my chest. I opened my mouth to respond, to say something, anything, that would put an end to this before it went too far. But before I could speak, he leaned in, just slightly, his eyes searching mine for permission. And I gave it to him. I didn't mean to. I didn't even realize I was moving until it was too late. But before I knew it, our faces were inches apart, and the world around us seemed to blur into nothing. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, feel the electricity in the air, and then, our lips met. It wasn't a passionate kiss, at least not at first. It was soft, hesitant, almost like we were both testing the waters. But the moment our lips touched, something inside me shattered. The guilt, the fear, the endless self-recrimination. It all fell away, leaving only the raw, undeniable connection between us. I reached up, my hand tangling in his hair, and pulled him closer, deepening the kiss in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The storm outside faded into the background, the movie forgotten, and all that mattered was him. His hands on my waist, his lips on mine, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world. And then, as suddenly as it had started, I pulled away. My chest was heaving, my heart racing, and the reality of what we'd just done hit me like a tidal wave. We can't, I whispered, my voice trembling. This is wrong. I know, he said, his own voice shaky. But it doesn't feel wrong. Not to me. His words should have made it easier to stop, but they didn't. If anything, they made it harder. Because the truth was, it didn't feel wrong to me either. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something I'd been waiting for my entire life without even realizing it. But that didn't change the facts. I was his stepmother. I was married to his father. What we were doing wasn't just forbidden, it was a betrayal of everything I was supposed to stand for. And yet, as I looked into his eyes, filled with a mixture of longing and regret, I knew this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The rest of the night was a blur. We sat there in silence, the space between us now charged with a tension that felt almost unbearable. When he finally stood up and said goodnight, I wanted to stop him, to say something that would make sense of the chaos in my mind. But I couldn't. I just watched him go, my heart heavy with the weight of what we'd just done. And as I sat there alone, the storm still raging outside, I realized the line had been crossed. There was no going back now. Everything had changed, and I had no idea how to put the pieces back together. The next morning was unbearable. I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that felt suffocating, like the weight of what had happened was pressing down on me, refusing to let me breathe. The storm outside had passed, but inside me, it raged on. I went through my morning routine mechanically, my hands shaking as I poured my coffee, my mind replaying the events of the night before like a film I couldn't turn off. When he walked into the kitchen, my heart stopped. For a moment, neither of us said anything. His hair was messy, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and there were faint shadows under his eyes. He looked as tired and conflicted as I felt. He mumbled a quiet, "Good morning," without meeting my gaze and headed straight for the coffee pot. The air between us was thick with tension, an invisible wall neither of us dared to cross. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, to somehow make things less awkward, but the words wouldn't come. What could I possibly say? "I'm sorry" felt hollow, insincere, because as much as I regretted the consequences, I didn't regret the moment. And that realization made the guilt even worse. As the days passed, the distance between us grew. He avoided being alone with me, always finding an excuse to leave the room whenever we happened to cross paths. When we did speak, our conversations were short, stilted, and filled with a tension that was impossible to ignore. It was like we were both walking on eggshells, afraid that one wrong step would shatter the fragile equilibrium we were clinging to. And then there was my husband. He wasn't the most observant man, but even he couldn't ignore the sudden shift in the house. "Is everything okay?" he asked one evening as we sat in the living room, him scrolling through his phone while I pretended to read a book. "You've been acting off lately." I forced a smile, my stomach twisting in knots. "I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." He didn't press further, but the way he looked at me, like he was trying to figure out a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, made my skin crawl. I hated lying to him, hated the way my actions were starting to unravel the fabric of our marriage, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. But what could I do? The truth would destroy everything. The guilt was relentless, gnawing at me every second of every day. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, my stepson's face, the way he looked at me, the way he kissed me, the way he whispered words that made me feel more alive than I'd felt in years. And then, I'd see my husband, completely oblivious, trusting me, loving me, and the guilt would come crashing down like a tidal wave. But there was another feeling too, one I tried desperately to ignore. Longing. As much as I hated myself for what had happened, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About him. About the way he made me feel. It was like an addiction, one I knew was toxic, dangerous, and destructive, but one I couldn't seem to let go of. The tension reached a boiling point one evening when we were alone in the house. My husband was working late again, and my stepson and I were both in the kitchen, awkwardly trying to avoid each other as we cooked separate meals. At one point, we reached for the same bowl, our hands brushing, and I felt that familiar spark, a spark that only made the situation worse. "I can't do this," he said suddenly, pulling his hand away like he'd been burned. I froze, my heart pounding. "Do what?" "This," he said, gesturing between us. "Pretending like nothing happened. Pretending like everything's normal when it's not." "What do you want me to say?" I asked, my voice trembling. "That I'm sorry? That I regret it?" "Because I do. I regret that we crossed a line we never should have crossed. But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to go back to the way things were." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite place. "We can't go back," he said quietly. "We both know that." And he was right. We couldn't. The line had been crossed, and there was no undoing it. The only thing we could do was move forward, but even that felt impossible. Every time I saw him, I was reminded of what we'd done. Every time I looked at my husband, I was reminded of the betrayal. And every time I was alone, I was reminded of the emptiness that had led me to this point in the first place. The fallout wasn't just internal, though. It started to seep into every aspect of my life. I became more irritable, snapping at my husband over small things, avoiding social interactions, retreating further into myself. My husband noticed, of course, but I always had an excuse ready. "I'm just stressed," I'd say. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was the weight of my choices, the burden of my guilt, and the inescapable reality that I had destroyed the delicate balance of my family. And no matter how hard I tried to act normal, nothing felt normal anymore. The house, once a place of routine and stability, now felt like a minefield. Every room held a memory, every glance carried a secret, every interaction was charged with an unspoken tension that threatened to explode at any moment. And I couldn't help but wonder, how long could we keep this up? How long before the cracks became too big to hide? But the scariest question of all was the one I couldn't bring myself to ask. What happens if it all comes crashing down? Because deep down, I knew it wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. I spent sleepless nights lost in an endless loop of thoughts that felt like they might drive me mad. The darkness of my bedroom became a canvas for every memory, every mistake, every regret that haunted me. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, my mind a relentless torrent of questions I couldn't answer. Was I a terrible person? Was I selfish, weak, broken? Or was I just a lonely woman who made a terrible mistake in a desperate attempt to feel alive again? The answers didn't matter because the guilt was the same either way. I wanted to end it, God, how I wanted to end it. I would sit at the kitchen table in the mornings, staring into my coffee, rehearsing the words in my head. This has to stop. We crossed a line. It can't happen again. But every time I saw him, every time his eyes met mine with that mix of longing and regret, the words died on my tongue. Because the truth was, I didn't want to stop. The connection we'd built was like a drug, intoxicating and impossible to quit. It was wrong, but it was also the only thing that made me feel anything at all. There were moments when I tried to justify it to myself, to rationalize the irrational. It's not like I planned this. I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray my husband, to destroy my family. It felt like something that had happened to me, like I was a passenger on a train I couldn't stop. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had made choices, small ones at first, then bigger ones. I had ignored the warning signs, dismissed the guilt, and let myself fall deeper into something I knew would end in disaster. The guilt was unbearable, but so was the longing. They coexisted in this twisted dance, each feeding off the other until I didn't know where one ended and the other began. I hated myself for what I'd done, for what I was still doing, but I couldn't stop wanting him. I couldn't stop craving the way he made me feel, seen, valued, desired. For years, I'd felt like a ghost in my own life, invisible and forgotten. And then he came along, and suddenly, I was alive again. But that life came at a cost, one I wasn't sure I could pay. Every time I looked at my husband, I felt the weight of my betrayal like a knife in my chest. He trusted me, depended on me, loved me in his own distant way, and I had shattered that trust. And yet, the more I thought about ending things with his son, the more I realized how much I depended on him. He was my anchor, my escape, my lifeline in a sea of loneliness. And that scared me more than anything. The nights were the hardest. Alone with my thoughts, I would replay everything in my head, the way his hand felt on mine, the way his lips tasted, the way he whispered my name like it was the most sacred word in the world. And then I'd think about the consequences, the people I was hurting, the family I was destroying, and the guilt would wash over me like a tidal wave. I started avoiding mirrors because I couldn't stand the woman staring back at me. She was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, someone I didn't want to be. But no matter how much I hated her, I couldn't change the way she felt. I couldn't change the way I felt. One night, I found myself sitting in the dark, my knees pulled to my chest, tears streaming down my face. I thought about leaving, just packing a bag and walking away from it all. From my husband, from my stepson, from the mess I had created. But where would I go? What would I do? Running away wouldn't solve anything, it would just leave more damage in its wake. I thought about confessing, about sitting my husband down and telling him everything. But the idea of seeing the look on his face, of watching his world crumble because of me, was more than I could bear. And so I stayed silent, trapped in a web of my own making, unable to move forward but too scared to go back. The worst part was the fear that this was who I really was. That the loneliness, the longing, the choices I'd made weren't the result of circumstances, but of something broken inside me. What kind of person does this? What kind of wife betrays her husband with his own son? I didn't have the answers, but the questions were enough to tear me apart. I started journaling, hoping it would help me make sense of the chaos in my head. I filled pages with thoughts and emotions I couldn't say out loud, trying to untangle the mess I'd created. But the more I wrote, the more I realized how lost I was. I didn't know who I was anymore or what I wanted. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this, caught between guilt and longing, between the life I had and the life I couldn't let myself want. And yet, every time I told myself it was over, every time I tried to pull away, something would happen to pull me back in a glance, a touch, a moment that reminded me of why I'd fallen in the first place. And each time, it became harder and harder to let go. I was trapped in a cycle I couldn't break, a storm I couldn't escape. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Because even though it was wrong, even though it was tearing me apart, it was the only thing that made me feel alive. And that, more than anything, was what terrified me the most. Have you ever found yourself caught in a situation you couldn't control? A place where your heart and mind were at war, pulling you in opposite directions, and no matter what choice you made, it felt like the wrong one? I never thought I'd find myself here. I always thought I was stronger, better, more in control. But the truth is, life doesn't always give you clean, simple choices. Sometimes it's messy, confusing, and filled with mistakes you can't undo. I know this story might make you think less of me. I wouldn't blame you if it did. But I also know that life isn't as black and white as we'd like it to be. It's filled with gray areas, with moments that test us in ways we never imagined. And I need to know, am I alone in this? Have you ever been in a situation where your emotions, your needs, your choices felt out of your hands, like they were controlling you instead of the other way around? If you've ever felt this way, if you've been in a place where your heart led you somewhere your mind knew you shouldn't go, please share your story in the comments. I want to hear from you. I need to hear from you. Maybe your words will help me find some clarity, some understanding, or at least some comfort in knowing I'm not the only one who's made a mess of things. And if you have advice, anything at all, I'm listening. Tell me what you think I should do. Tell me how to fix this, if it can even be fixed. Or tell me how to live with it, how to carry the weight of my choices without letting it crush me. Because right now, I feel like I'm drowning, and I don't know how to come up for air. Loneliness is a powerful thing. It creeps in slowly, so quietly that you don't even realize it's there until it's wrapped itself around you, tightening its grip. It whispers lies in your ear, telling you that you're invisible, that you're forgotten, that you don't matter. And if you're not careful, it can lead you to dark places, places you never thought you'd go. That's what happened to me. I let the loneliness fester, let it hollow me out until I was desperate for anything, anyone, to fill the void. And in doing so, I hurt the people I love most. I never imagined I'd be the kind of person who could betray her family, who could cross a line that should never be crossed. But here I am, living with the consequences of my choices every single day. The guilt, the regret, the longing, they're always there, like shadows I can't escape. And the worst part is knowing that I can't take any of it back. I can't undo the damage I've done, no matter how much I wish I could. If you're listening to this and you're feeling invisible, if you're feeling lost or unloved or forgotten, please don't let it fester the way I did. Talk to someone. Reach out for help. Don't wait until the loneliness becomes so overwhelming that it pushes you into a place you can't come back from. Because once you cross that line, there's no going back. There's only the aftermath, and trust me, it's not a place you want to be. I don't know what the future holds for me, for my family, for the relationships I've broken. But I do know this: I'll carry the weight of my choices for the rest of my life. And I'll spend every day trying to be better, trying to heal, trying to make amends, even if some wounds can never fully be healed. So, if you're out there, if you've been where I am, or if you're standing at the edge of the same precipice, I'm begging you, don't let yourself fall. Seek help. Find someone who will listen, who will remind you that you're not alone. Because loneliness is a dark, dangerous road, and no one should have to walk it alone.